Hi, I'm Kristen and this is Scrap Fabric Love. Today I'm talking about 5 budget-friendly alternatives to store-bought quilt batting. I didn't know when I started quilting about all the different types of batting that were available, your polyester, your cotton, your poly blend, your bamboo, all of these. And I was kind of shocked when I found out the price of them. So I still do use store-bought batting, don't get me wrong, but I do also like to look for some alternatives to, 1, save some money, but 2, to be just a little bit more eco-friendly in my quilting. So I'm going to tell you 5 alternatives today that maybe you can try if you want to save money on your quilt batting. So the first one is towels, cotton towels. So when I first started quilting, I wasn't kind of versed in the whole commercial world of quilt stores and fat quarter bundles and all of the stuff that we all get into when we start quilting. So in my head, patchwork and quilting was all about this reuse and use what you have kind of mentality from back in the day. So I just got some old towels, kind of like this one. Let me just show you. They were a bit threadbare, maybe had some stains. I don't know where this black mark came from. This is a great big bath sheet. It's fairly thin. And I used that for my first 2 baby quilts that I made. One of them was quite stiff because I also used upholstery fabric for that one because I didn't know about quilting fabric at that point. But the other one, the one I did use quilting fabric for, I felt it was nice and cozy. It was more the thickness I would expect from a quilt or a nice comfy blanket, possibly a little bit thicker though than your like polyester or cotton battings, well, low loft polyester or cotton battings. So it depends how thin your towel is, basically. When I use the towels, I do cut off things like these. So this is like a decorative, I don't know what you call that, but anyway, the decorative piping kind of things you get, or heavily embroidered motifs on the towels. I cut those off just because it's a different thickness to the rest of the towel. And I usually trim off these edges as well, unless of course I'm just making a baby quilt the size of the bath sheet. But if I was going to join and make more than one, I would cut off those bits, and then you could just zigzag it together, or you could just put it in as you're quilting if you're doing quilt as you go. And you can usually find towels like, if you don't have any in your own house, you can also find them in thrift stores, charity shops, things like that. So that's one, old towels. Second one that I've been getting into using a lot is flannel sheets. So this is just an offcut of the one for the last quilt that I used. This is one of these stripy flannel sheets. So this has obviously been cut off the side when I quilted my whole quilt, and this is what was left over. So I can still use this somewhere, but anyway, just to show you what I'm talking about. And this is a bit bobbly. I bought it on eBay from somebody else. I can't remember the exact size, but I think it might have been a double or a queen. And it would have been like, I'm in the UK, so it was like about £7 or so. And if you bought a bag of batting, like the cheapest would be polyester, that'd probably be 22 quid, something like that. And then you go up from there when you get to the cotton and the poly blends and stuff, if you're talking about a double quilt batting package, right? So in terms of budget friendly, this is very budget friendly. It's thinner. So when I use these, I prefer to use a backing that's like fleece. Or I've got one quilt that I put in the Festival of Quilts competition last year in the sustainable quilts category. I used a flannel sheet as the batting, and then the backing was an old IKEA curtain, and the front was denim. So the whole thing was really heavy. Arguably, I didn't need the sheet as well, but I like to use the batting. So anyway, depending on how thick the other materials you're using are, or how heavy or light you like your quilts, this can be a good option. It does give some warmth. And it's got a nice drape, I think is the word for it. So it just hangs really well. And in terms of how closely together you need to quilt things, it's not like quilt batting, right? Because this already has been through the wash who knows how many times, and it's holding its shape. So unlike if you were to put cotton batting through the wash machine, it would kind of fall apart, right? So you kind of get to experiment with how close or not close you want your quilting to be with a flannel sheet, or indeed with the towels before, because these are things that have already weathered the test of time. And so possibly you could get away with quilting that's further apart. So that's a bit of a benefit of any of these reused secondhand materials. So again, I bought this on eBay, but again, I could have found it in a thrift store, or family members who are having house clear outs, ask them to save stuff like that for you. They can make good alternatives. And obviously, since they're already made for beds, they come in the sizes that you might want. So you can find a king flannel sheet or queen or whatever, and you don't have to do any piecing, which is awesome. The next one that can be a good alternative. So I have another video about using fleece as backing on quilts. And in that video, I talked about the kind of debate about whether or not you would use batting with that as well or not. So one option is to just use an old fleece blanket as the backing of your quilt and don't have a batting in between. That'll give you a nice thin-ish, but still, because it's the fleece, it's still warm enough quilt.
So whether or not you're using just fleece fabric that you've pieced into a backing or an old fleece blanket, if you feel like that's thick enough for your quilt, you can just skip the batting altogether, which obviously is going to be a bit of a cost saving.
I still like to have batting in my fleece quilts, but if I was doing one now, I probably would use a flannel sheet, fleece backing, and then my quilt top. And I would kind of like the heaviness of that. But you can use lots of different kinds of old blankets. So for another quilt that I put in Festival of Quilts 2 years ago, I used an old wool blanket as the batting. It was more of an art quilt, so it was made to hang on the wall, and I wanted it to be fairly sturdy. So it was thick and heavy, but it did quilt quite nicely. And again, because it's already a blanket that's holding itself together, I don't need to particularly worry about where my quilting stitches are and whether or not they're all even, because it's not going to fall apart on me.
I also used an old wool blanket for this quilt, which was partially denim, partially shirt fabric, so it did end up quite heavy. But it was this kind of sort of 70s style wool blanket that I used as the batting for that.
And using things like old blankets, of course, harkens back to back in the day when quilting was about just you reusing what you already had and making the most of it. So I do quite like that as an alternative. And you can find all sorts of different thicknesses of blankets in, again, thrift stores, eBay, your friends and family, whoever. And that can be just a great way of having a quick, low-cost batting for your quilt. And the last one that I wanted to talk about is just batting scraps. So lots of people have probably seen ways that you can piece these together. I have a video about that on my channel, which I'll link to in the description. So this, again, is just a piece of batting that was trimmed off of another quilt project. So if you keep them together by batting type, or if you generally only buy your favorite type, then all your scraps will be the same. You can eventually build up enough of these to use as the batting in your quilt. So you can some people piece them together, some people just slide them in as they go on a long arm, or if you do quilt as you go, obviously you can just cut them into your blocks or your rows or however you're dividing your quilt up, and you just make that batting that you did buy stretch a bit further. Or you can buy these kind of scraps from other quilters, because obviously different quilters have different tolerances for saving stuff like this and for piecing things like this. So some people like to pay for the convenience of just having something that's set size and whatever's left over is rubbish. And some people like to be frugal and kind of make the most of everything that comes their way. That's a bit more me. But you could, if you're in a quilt group, you could ask folk if they have scraps they don't want. Most people would be happy to get rid of them. They might not even charge you for them. Or you can buy other people's leftovers like this everywhere else that I mentioned about this eBay, Facebook Marketplace, things like that. I'll put a picture on the screen of a listing I saw recently of someone selling a whole range of different kinds of batting. And if you do smaller, like art quilts and things like that, that's a great way of both trying out different batting and saving money on it. So that's another great way. So those are my top 5 favorite alternatives to quilt store batting. I am trying to be more eco-conscious in my quilting than I maybe have been previously. When I first got stuck with the quilting bug, although I was very into kind of reuse and things like that, it's very easy to get pulled into the folks saying you need to have, you know, the perfect 80-20 batting or wool blend batting or whatever it is, or this particular thing for the particular quilt project. So I did probably buy more store-bought batting than I should have when I started off. So when I do buy new batting now, I try and buy bamboo because it's more eco-friendly, but I'm also trying to make a conscious effort to, where I can, use things like flannel sheets, old blankets, and using up my leftovers. One point I would make on all of these, obviously most quilt batting comes in, you know, a white or an off-white, or you can buy black if you're making a black quilt. But so I would say for the towels, the blankets, the sheets, go for lighter colors if your quilt is lighter, darker colors if your quilt is darker. I've used sort of a pale pink and pale yellow when I've used wool blankets as a batting. I've got another flannel sheet somewhere that's like a cream, which I will use in another one. And this one is basically, you know, white with some very pastel-y stripes. But if my quilt was white, I might see the darkest of these stripes through it. So just have a think about what am I going to put on top of it, and am I going to see whatever the pattern is that's underneath. Same with the towels. So the lighter the color, probably the safest you're going to be with that, because that'll be the closest to the color you would normally get quilt batting. I would love to hear in the comments if you use anything I haven't mentioned as quilt batting, because obviously I'm always looking for more alternatives that I can try. And I'd also like to hear your experience if you've used any of these, didn't work for some reason, or it worked really well for a certain type of quilt and not another. I would love to hear about that. So please do drop that in the comments. I hope you found something you can use in this video, and I'd love to see you again next time. I generally make scrap quilts, often denim quilts, and I don't follow a whole lot of quilting rules. So my channel is meant to be a beginner-friendly, accepting place for however you want to quilt. So if you haven't subscribed already and that sounds good, I hope you'll consider it, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks so much for spending time with me. Bye.